I know that the conference is working on the theme of diaspora. And so I want to start off by talking about how I'm working with diaspora in this presentation. I'm working with the idea of diaspora as dispersal, which is where the word diaspora comes from. Like it comes from Greece, and it has to do this idea of dispersal and the idea of people being dispersed from their homelands. Angela's talk was focusing mostly on one particular diaspora, the Sikh, Punjabi, South Asian, Canadian community. And I'm going to be talking about multiple different types of diaspora, but mostly I'm interested in looking at and kind of stretching the definition of diaspora and thinking about the dispersal of communities of resistance and their relationships to each other through diaspora. Okay, I don't know if this conference was planned to be held on the weekend of National Truth and Reconciliation Day, let alone on Orange T-shirt Day, but it is very serendipitous that this is the time, and this is what I'm going to start off by talking. So I'm going to start off with a story, an Outernational story. Okay, so I'm taking us back to May 2021 in Kamloops, BC, and there was an announcement. An announcement came from the Tk'emlúps, Secwepemc First Nations. They made an announcement to confirm, not to announce, but not to discover, but to confirm that the remains of 215 undocumented Indigenous children's bodies were found around the site of the Kamloops Indian residential schools. I'm assuming most of us will remember this time when this announcement was made. I got this announcement through social media, and on my social media feed, I saw lots of outrage at the time, and the sentiment was more or less like this: how can this happen in Canada? This is the outrage, the shock, the feeling that 215 was way too high. This is So that's what I was seeing on the feed, and seeing it on the feed put me at a distance from my phone. I didn't have this. I had an emotional response, but not the same kind of emotional response. I belong to this collective called IR Indigenous Resistance, and it's a global collective. This is a lot of the work that's been done through Indigenous Resistance. It's a collaborative work of artists and activists all over the world. And this is a cover of an album that Indigenous Resistance did, that IR did. And I'm mostly showing this cover because it came out around the same time, but more importantly, it gives you a sense of who's involved, just visually, ethnically, who is involved. The only two people who are not involved are these two people here, the revolutionary leader, Thomas Sankara, and the musician, Fela Kuti. But everyone else here is involved, and I'm involved as well, too. So when that announcement came out about 215 bodies, I was in conversation with at least one person from IR, and we were talking about, and we were emotionally affected by what happened and what was discovered, but my thing was, as someone who studies, who comes out of post-colonial studies, studies colonialism, I know that whenever there's anything that's genocidal, that involves lots of violence, the official number is always low, whether it be with something like residential school survivors or the discovery of bodies, partition, the Jewish Holocaust, the number of people who were killed through the Middle Passage, from Africa to through enslavement. The official number is always a lowball figure, right? So together with one of the collaborators of IR, we came up with a very simple algebraic code to describe how we felt about this situation. And how we felt was this. We created this algebraic code, 215 plus x. So 215 to acknowledge the number of bodies that were discovered at the school, and x to represent the unknown number of bodies that have yet to be discovered. Right? And as we all know, that number 215 has escalated. We are now close to 2,000. But x, even as we discover, even as the numbers come out, the X is important because it recognizes the unknown, including those bodies which will never be discovered, right? So this was like a small graphic, and it was, again, I got the news through social media. So then this was something that IR circulated on social media, this image. And it's an image that was created by one of the collaborators. His name is Dubdem. He's a graphic designer based in Brazil. Okay. As I go through this, I want you to keep track of not only the names, but the places that I'm going to be mentioning. Okay. So this is about a week or two after the announcement came out from Turtle Island. Okay. Shortly after, this graphic was designed, and it says Africans with a K standing alongside Indigenous children on Turtle Island. And this one was created for a purpose. It was created also for social media purposes, but specifically for a video. Okay? This is Kabaka Classity Labarton. He is a vocalist and an MC in a group called Sankara Future Dub Resurgence. He is part of the IR collective. Him and his group is part of the IR collective. They've been involved with IR recordings. So on the 2 weeks after the discovery of 215 and the posting of 215 plus X, he gathered two children at Lake Nalubale in Uganda, and they created a video. A boy, a young girl, they're standing by the lake, and I can't show the video, but I will read the script that they read out together. Okay. We want to honor the 215 Indigenous children whose bodies were found unceremoniously buried on the grounds of a residential school in Kamloops, Canada. We want to acknowledge X, the unknown number of bodies yet to be discovered at other residential, boarding, and industrial schools throughout Turtle Island. The X's also demand that those bodies must be found at all such institutions of colonial genocide on Turtle Island. Last but not least, because African peoples stand with you. Can you hear okay? Yeah, okay. So that message was put out as a video, and it was also read in two languages. It was read in English, but then also in Kabaka's own, I don't know the exact name, but it's a vernacular Ugandan language as well too. The next month, in Candelaria district, street area in Bogota, Colombia, a mural was created, and it's created by this fellow, Sumula Dub. The word dub is going to come up a number of times. And it's the same image, but it's painted on a street corner in Colombia. And the message is very similar. It's summarized, but it's very similar, except it's in Spanish. And it's on the street, and people are actually walking by the street. And this is the picture we have here is an Afro-Colombian woman. She's masked. It's a reminder that two things. One, this is during the pandemic. Number two, the streets were actually watching it too. Okay. Next one is that same image I found recently, and it was actually featured in one of our books, in the IR book, and it's called Searching for the Dub Sublime that came out last year. So the image from Colombia, the image that was used on social media, the image that was used in Uganda, this was now, all these three are posted in Mexico. I'm not sure which part of Mexico, but in Mexico, nevertheless. All right, so we have 215, the announcement, that came from Turtle Island, right? From the Tecumseh Tecumseh, First Nation. We have a graphic designer working on this from Brazil. We have a video announcement taking place in Uganda, right? And not even in the cities of Uganda, but specifically in a more, non-urban setting. And then we have it being repurposed, translated in Bogota, Colombia, but then also in Mexico. And so we're working with a number of different places, but then we're also working in a number of different languages. And I'm not doing justice by saying Spanish because we're talking about Latin American Spanish and, of course, regional variations. So we have all of this happening in different places. And so the big question I want to put out here is as a counter argument. This is not my question, but I felt the need, especially while working on this presentation, that I need to put a counter argument. Why, right? Why would anyone do this? Why would, and I know why. I know why this community would do this. I know why Canadians are recognizing 215 plus X. Why Canadians are, honoring, this issue with Orange, Shirt Day. National Truth Day, a Day of Truth and Reconciliation. I understand what's happening in a Canadian context, a Turtle Island context. But I'm putting out this question, why does everyone else care? What does everyone else have to gain? So I'm putting it as a counter argument, but I'm putting it as a counter argument to also think about, let's take one step back. And my question, I want to really first work with what is actually happening here. Before we get to why, what is actually happening here? And my answer for this is outer nationalism. This is what outer nationalism looks like. Okay, so then the next question is, what is outer nationalism? Okay, so outer nationalism is a concept I've been working with for about, 15 years or so. And I've written about it, and I've also been off the radar with it. And I think the best way to think about outer nationalism is to think about it in relationship to its root word, nationalism. So I'm going to walk through a couple of concepts here and a couple of theoretical, framework pieces. When we're talking about nationalism, it's really simple. We're talking about citizens under a state, citizens governed by a state, citizens in relationship to each other, citizens having rights, and this idea that Benedict Anderson has of, a nation is an imagined community. We don't all know each other, but we are all thinking, feeling, reading, doing something at the same time. For example, we are all together outraged by 215, right? So that's nationalism. Internationalism is when we have, and you all know this, but I'm just going to break it down anyway. Internationalism is when nations are working together, right? It's a nation-to-nation relationship. And most importantly, it's about the elites in each nation working across. Transnationalism is used to talk about when people are crossing borders, they may or may not be elites, but they're developing relationships that no longer are tied to a nation, right? In this case, nations, we have nation to nation, we're crossing boundaries, and the relationship is not about the two nations in themselves, okay? Outer nationalism is a variation, it's a remix of transnationalism. And so it's a form of transnationalism, but it's also something very different. And we need this word, or I need this word, so we can articulate that difference. This kind of comes back to what you were talking about with people who are caught between cultures, right? And this myth of culture clash, and which culture do you belong to? And the word we're looking for is hybridity, right? And how hybridity is often that word that is used to talk about new forms of culture when two different cultures come, mix, fuse, interact, and so forth. Okay, this is Arif Dirlik. He's a Turkish-born scholar of China. He's a sinologist. And in the late 90s, he wrote this book called Post-Colonial Aura. This is at the time when post-colonial studies is booming. And one of the concepts that is booming with post-colonial studies is hybridity, right? The same concept that we're talking about, right? And so he's a Marxist critic because for him, transnationalism is always about capitalism. It's always about transnational capitalism. It's not about how people relate between borders, it's how capital flows across borders, with or without the help of the state. So he has a critique of hybridity. It's a small line in the book, but I hang on to it. I hang on to the small things too, right? It's the small things, right? But let's read it. The hybridity that post-colonial criticism refers to is uniformly a hybridity between the post-colonial and the first world. Never, to my knowledge, between one post-colonial intellectual and another, right? So the shorthand here is that it's about, when we're talking about hybridity, we're always thinking about the West and the non-West, white and black or non-white. We're basically always working within a context that has to include white, Western, global North versus global South. What happens is we end up reaffirming, and I'm kind of building on what he's saying, because he's obviously focused on the capitalism part of it, but building on that is that what ends up happening is that we end up reaffirming white supremacy and Eurocentrism. So that's his critique of hybridity, which it's a really important critique. But at the same time, I want to hang on to hybridity, and I want to hang on to transnationalism. So for that, I found the work of Paul Gilroy really valuable, right? And so Gilroy's, book, which for me is one of the best, one of the best books of cultural theory that I have ever read in my life, The Black Atlantic, comes out in 1993, before Arif Dilip's work. And he's trying to find ways to theorize, what is Black culture, specifically diasporic Black culture, right? And his point is that diasporic Black culture is about transnational exchanges, right? It's about the exchanges between African, Caribbean, UK, North American, and North American communities. And so he has this kind of nice little wordplay, and that is about, it's not about our roots to Africa, but it's about ROUTES. It's about how culture travels across the Atlantic, how it crisscrosses the Atlantic Ocean. And the idea that culture in the process is always moving, and it's through those kinds of networks, those kinds of exchanges, these crisscrossing, these roots, that people connect. They build solidarities, they find alliances, and so on and so forth. The one thing about the Black Atlantic, which I love it so much, but the one thing about it is that it's very specific. He's talking about diasporic Black culture, specifically, which means he's not talking about African culture. It's not Afrocentrism at all. But he is talking, if it puts anything in the center, it's the Middle Passage. It's 1619. It's the era of slavery and onwards, right? So he's working with a racial, ethnic, and historical context that's very specific. And so for me, outernationalism is closer to this when it comes to talking about things like transnationalism, because this is transnational. It's not limited to one type of nation or whatnot. But at the same time, I want to go beyond thinking about this stuff in terms of one ethnic group, okay, or one historical experience. So Outernationalism is actually a song by IR. It came out last year. This song, meaning it has music. And it features a number of people, but it's also a film. And I'm showing some images from the film. It's a film about this woman. Her name is Verse 12, and she's a poet. She's of Ethiopian and Saudi Arabian background. And she's walking through the desert. And it's a very minimal film. She's just walking through the desert. She finds a place to sit down. She meditates. And she reads, she's kind of, and then she eventually finds this man his name is Muhammad, and he's a Bedouin. And he's part of a land and a community that exists on the border of Egypt, but its actual specific location nation-wise is uncertain. There's a narrator, and that narrator is the voice of Ukweli, who's a Toronto-based house DJ, but he's actually narrating here. The music is made by Herman Soy Sauce Pearl. He's a Pittsburgh-based electronic musician. And there's a painting, not painting, but it's a poster that she's also holding the video that features the Indigenous leader, Poundmaker, along with three women who are Black feminists holding the Black Power symbol, and an image down below that looks a lot like my t-shirt, which I'll talk about in a minute. And of course, she has this bag that says dub. So the video actually offers an explanation of outernationalism. If we had time, I'd actually play it, but we'll just look at the script. Okay, this is what Ukweli is reading. While internationalism is the world of national leaders, diplomats, and other elites working together within institutional structures of power, outernationalism describes the flow of dub between nations, the critical dialogue, the creative collaboration, the friendships and the solidarities that are developed between people from different nations and in defiance of the borders that divide them. By people, I mean the poets, the sound systems, the protesters, the prophets, the underground club scenes, the street demonstrations, and other social forms of collective resistance. Okay. I'm going to come out of the poetry for a moment. Let's go back to the breakdown of these three concepts: nation, nationalism, internationalism, and outernationalism. So I'm going to work with hyphens here. Okay, so if we're talking about nationalism, we're talking about citizen-to-citizen relationships, right? And that's what I'm really focusing on here, is about relationships. If we're talking about internationalism, we're talking about nation to nation, state to state, elite to elite. Outer nationalism is, again, a form of transnationalism, but a specific form of transnationalism. It's about the oppressed to the oppressed, the racialized to the racialized, the colonized to the colonized, the margin to the margin, as opposed to the center to the center. Most importantly, counterculture to counterculture, and this is the most important part, and that is resistance movements to resistance movements. They're all, these are the kinds of groups that are in relationship to each other across national boundaries. Okay, so I'm gonna tell a couple of outer national stories, and then we're gonna really kind of like, come back to this definition of what this means, and go back to that question I have is, why do people do this? Okay, so this is, Indigenous resistance does a number of different things. We've seen the social media posts, they do short films, they also make books, and these books contain like essays that are written in dialogue, but then also photo essays as well too. So I'm gonna show you a short photo essay, or something that came from the photo essay. This is a book called Indigenous and Black Wisdom, and it says it's called A Sound Book and a Soundtrack for Critical and Creative Resistance. It's a sound book because there's an album that goes with it, so the book is accompanying the album, but then the album is also accompanying the book, so they have a cool relationship to each other. Okay, so the first image, this is a wisdom image, okay? An Indigenous and Black wisdom image. We have an Indigenous woman with 2 children, and she's in Jamaica, and there's these features of big 70s roots reggae Jamaican stars or icons of the time. The other image here is of 2 Indigenous men, one younger, older, I'm not sure about the age, but they are in front of a reggae record shop. What's happening, I'm gonna kind of oscillate for a moment between these 2 images. What's happening here is, well, it's interventions. The first one is, these are not real photographs. These are photographic remixes. The original images of the Indigenous people, those images are taken from, I believe, Turtle Island, but south of the Canadian border, maybe in Dakota. They're also images from the 70s. These are people who were originally photographed on reservations. So what we have in these photos are of people who are being remixed to not be on reservations. They're off-res. And it's almost like they're on vacation, right? And they're on vacation in Jamaica. Now, as we all know, especially like when I grew up in the 80s and stuff, when we see, and even still today, when we see images of Jamaica, we mostly see white people on beaches, right? That's the image we see. We don't see street scenes. We don't see record shops, right? And what's really happening here is actually, it's an imagined relationship between Indigenous communities and not just Jamaican communities, but specifically the counterculture of 70s Rastafarian-based roots reggae, like protest-heavy roots reggae, right? So it's about that kind of clash that's happening through this kind of remix. So this is one form of outer nationalism that actually this is the type of outer nationalism that IR first started doing work around in terms of relationships between Indigenous and people of African descent. The one thing I want to kind of add here also is that this is why I need to have a concept like outer nationalism, because it's so similar to what we would see in Paul Gilroy's book, but Paul Gilroy is focused on one type of experience. The experience, the large, massive, and terribly violent experience, of the Middle Passage. But here we're taking it one step further by having people who are subject to, to other histories as well too. Okay, this is a still from a short film called When Silence Rises from Earth. Does anyone know what 433 means? Anybody? Yes. It's a John Cage composition where the musician is required to sit in front of their instrument and not touch it for 4 minutes and 33 seconds. They create silence. So it's a minimal piece. This is Sankara featured dub resurgence. The same fellow Kabaka is in this video as well too, that we saw for 215+X. And they're performing this piece where they're holding silence, an African moment of silence as they call it, in their space called the Dub Museum, for 4 minutes and 33 seconds. And this took place at the end of 2020, was released in 2021. So it's a film that adapts John Cage's concept, remixes it a little bit in a couple of different ways, because John Cage's thing was just about sound and silence. This is a film where they're performing silence by warming up drums, but not playing them, and they're doing it in a traditional way. But then around the Dub Museum, on the walls of the Dub Museum, is this massive collage of all these posters. And I'm going to walk through the posters. So we have an image of the Afro-Martinican revolutionary and psychoanalyst, Frantz Fanon. There's a quote from him: "This woman who sees without being seen frustrates the colonizer." He's talking about the radical power of an Algerian woman in hijab during the Algerian anti-colonial revolution. And he's kind of looking at this side, but then he's looking directly at this Palestinian woman who's also in a kind of hijab, getting ready for a protest. There's images here of the dub reggae musician, Augustus Pablo from Jamaica, James Baldwin. This is an image of the office of James Carpenter, Grey Owl, who is an Indigenous healer and medicine man based in Toronto. And then there's all these images here. Actually, let's zoom in. Yes, that's the first slide that I was just talking about. Okay, so Fanon, the unnamed Palestinian woman, James Baldwin, James Carpenter, Grey Owl, Augustus Pablo. And then there's another set of images here, many of which had to do with the genocide against indigenous peoples in West Papua, right? Just near Indonesia. But it's not just, there's some people here who are from West Papua, but then there's also Afro-Colombian women involved in that protest, people from Turtle Island involved in that protest, Sankara Future Dub Resurgence, based in Uganda, also doing work around that protest. And then we also have John Cage, but it's not just John Cage on his own. He's talking to the free jazz innovator, the jazz musician, Sun Ra. And we have Fanon at the end looking back at the whole thing. So in this case, this is Outernational, but it's not just about Black and Indigenous relationships. There's multiple relationships that are being communicated, they're showing a kind of global scale. If 433, the sound piece, is minimalist, this is a kind of a maximalist, representation. But the whole point is to show these relationships and to make these kinds of connections. Crickety is the name of a song. It's also the song that featured on this IR 12-inch. Came out in 2008. This is an image of an indigenous Crickety woman in Brazil. She belongs to an indigenous community whose community is involved in a violent dispute over their lands, which are being taken over by the Brazilian government. And it looks like a violent image, with all these soldiers, and she's holding her unclothed baby with her back turned against them. But I actually look at this as an empowering image. She's actually holding them all back. This is an image of resistance, for me. So this was an EP that was dedicated to their struggles, and their struggles actually involved not just pushing back, but they actually went and destroyed power lines in order to hold on to their land. And I believe they succeeded in that with that strategy as well too. The recording features a whole bunch of different musicians, and I'll walk through at least two of them. This is Mad Mike Banks. He's the leader of the collective called Underground Resistance, UR. So there's IR and then there's UR. And UR is a globally renowned Detroit-based collective of mostly Black musicians who make electronic music. And we're still living in this world. It's getting a little bit better, but we still live in this world where people have a hard time understanding that Black musicians can make electronic music, and then number two, that actually they're the originators of the music as well too. But the interesting thing with Mad Mike Banks is, I'm going to talk about his identity for a second. He is Black Indigenous. One side of his family is of African descent. The other side of the family is Choctaw, from the southern U.S. And then there's the image of we're getting there. And then there's the image here of Aniruddha Das, who's also known as Dangsha, who's from this group called Asian Dub Foundation. And I bring these two names up because they're both electronic musicians. They both make political music. This one focuses more on the US and Black struggles. This one focuses more on immigrant struggles in the UK, but especially Black and South Asian struggles. And they both have lots of renown, but two things are happening here. Number one, they're working together. They have big audiences, but their audiences are not the same audience. Their audiences are actually very separate, despite both being like, just the mere difference of the Atlantic, but also different styles. Like this is more drum bass, this is more techno, might not mean much to anybody, but it does create divisions. That's number one. The second that's happening is here, this is actually what, I'm showing you images of connections, but this is actually a case of outer-national collaboration, where they're actually working together, not just working together, but also working together to address this issue. And people from the cricketees, their voices are also featured on the track as well too. So I'm going to zoom in on the t-shirt that Dangsha is wearing, which I'm also wearing. And this is a t-shirt for another recording from 2021 called Anarchist Africa. I want to talk about the symbols, and that's going to get us to our definition of outer-national in a second. There's 4 symbols here. Number one, most obvious one, is the African continent, and how that refers to, that conjures the image of Pan-Africanism, right? Which is also a transnational image as well too. Then you have the circle A, which comes out of anarchist punk rock. Then we have Jugad. Jugad is a South Asian word. I actually learned it through the Punjabi word because of a panel that you were on one time with a number of Sikh Canadian artists, and the word Jugad came up, and they talked about how it just means do it yourself. And I lit up because, oh my gosh, I think I just found the South Asian word for punk rock, because the DIY is the same concept. People think anarchists, they think, oh, these are people who want to destroy the world. No, they're actually talking about DIY, doing things yourself. And last but not least, we have Amharic at the top here. Amharic being a biblical language, but then also being the language of Ethiopia. And what's being written up here is resistance dub. You've heard me talk a lot about resistance, all these connections with communities of resistance. But dub is the central piece that ties it all together. So what is dub? There's a couple of layers here. I'll be able to wrap up soon, yeah. So I'm taking dub from the definition on the second page of another book by IR called Searching for the Dub Sublime. The aesthetic part of the sublime, that idea of the sublime is key here. But let's start with the definition. Let's dive into it. So these are 2 pictures of studio mixing boards, one by King Jammy from Jamaica, and also Lee Parry. Lee Parry was known as, he was called by Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones, the Pablo Picasso of sound, because the way he used sound in his studio in Jamaica. There's so much I can say about Lee Parry, but let's talk about dub first. Okay, so number one, dub comes out of Jamaican sound system, reggae culture. It's a type of electronic music that was born out of the 70s in that countercultural era of Jamaican roots reggae. And what happens with dub is the studio engineer is the musician. The way they're using the mixing boards I just showed to you, the way they use those, like we think of music in terms of the guitarist, the drummer, the bass, the singer, but with dub, the studio engineer is the musician, and how they manipulate sound, that, and how they control the mixing board. The mixing board becomes an instrument, okay? And there's like all kinds of, sonic manipulation. It's some of the most psychedelic music you'll ever hear in your life if you haven't heard it before. And these recordings are often found on the B-sides of a record, the 7-inch B-sides. The A-side would be the vocal version. The B-side was the dub mix. Or the dub version. That's where the word dub comes from. So that's the musical definition of it. Let's take this mixology one step further and think about IR. With IR, we're taking the idea, when I say we, I mean like all of us, but the idea is that each channel on that mixing board is not just there for sonic manipulation. Each channel has the potential to be a voice from someone from a different background, okay? And when you have all those voices that are being mixed together, you have dialogue, okay? And Mikhail Bakhtin would call this polyphony, but IR would call this simply outer-national dub. It's applying the same concept of mixing voices on a mixing board to anything, whether it be protest on social media, collage, the recording process, film. This is basically where it all comes down. That whole idea of mixology is what is being used as a kind of philosophical inspiration for what we're talking about here as outernational dub. So I come back to that question: why would anyone do this? Why would they want to mix things together? Because I think of Malcolm X, when he left the Nation of Islam. There's a moment in that film, the Spike Lee movie, where he's asked, "What do you have to say now about, what is the role of white people in the anti-racism struggle?" And he said, "There can be no black-white unity until there's black unity." Right? This is one way of approaching, the issue of racism. I can talk to you in a moment later about how Malcolm X himself was actually far more outer nationalist than that. But the question is, why would anyone do this? And I'm coming back to also the ideas of hybridity here too. Why all this mixing, all this mixology? On one level, it seems like, is it just mixing for the sake of mixing? Is it a kind of rainbow, like a kind of like We Are the World type situation, but without white people? Like a darker rainbow? What is this? And this is where I come back to IR's own philosophy. I'm going to read this, but I'm going to focus on this bold part here. Actually, yeah, I'll read the whole thing. Dub is too often defined as a musical style, a subgenre of reggae music, and its influence on other genres is equally narrow, reduced to the use of echo and reverb effects. For IR, dub is not a thing, it's the quality of a thing, the dub quality of anything. We live in a world where music, as well as other forms of resistance, protest, and social justice language are institutionalized, neutralized, and devitalized into the colonial capitalist white stream. Dub is the B-side to these moments of assimilation and co-optation. Dub is about fermenting trouble, making Babylon tremble. Babylon is the metaphor that comes out of Rastafarian discourse, Rastafarian theology. It's a metaphor, or liberation theology. Babylon means capitalism, colonialism, racism, nationalism, right? It means all ultranationalism, far-rightism. It means all those things. Sexism you could put in there, homophobia you could put in there, and all the intersectionality with all that. What I'm getting at here is that when we talk about trouble and tremble, we're talking about how it has, like outer nationalism, that mixology, it has to be political, right? And it's coming with the awareness that, one of the playbook for colonialism from day one, and I know this intimately from South Asian studies, the playbook from day one is divide and conquer, keep people apart. And so outer nationalism takes, and knowing that when people are together, they can actually make a difference and fight back and resist and find freedom, right? So outer nationalism is explicitly like a kind of like a mental reminder to keep to keep things unstable because of that divide and conquer mentality of any kind of like systemic oppression. So I'm an English professor, so I like alliteration, right? So I began with all these D words, right? Dispersal, diaspora, and so on and so forth. I'm going to switch now to C. I got a couple of C words to kind of tie things up. We're talking about connection. We're talking about communication. We're talking about collaboration. We're talking about creativity. But ultimately, it's all about the dub. Okay, thank you.